It is a pandemic, a global epidemic. Four years ago, the World Health Organization forecast that by the year 2000, 15 to 20 million people would be infected with HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. This year, they doubled that forecast. And this month, an independent study based at Harvard University said the pandemic is spinning out of control. 110 million adults and 10 million children may soon be infected. The fastest growing group, women, who may pass it to their children at birth or through mother's milk. More than 90% of new cases are heterosexually transmitted, and new cases will climb to 3 million in Southeast Asia in the next 5 years, to 2 million in South America. Another 500,000 North Americans and Europeans will soon be infected. Countries from the Middle East to the Far East are playing catch-up with the disease. Americans are waking up to the realization that AIDS has doubled in their teen population in just 2 years. And in Africa's Holocaust, the world may be looking at its future. Here, AIDS is a family disease. Homosexuality and drug use account for less than 1% of AIDS cases in Africa. The World Health Organization predicts that 3 million African children will die of AIDS in this decade, and they ask, who will care for the 6 million more who will be orphaned? According to WHO, AIDS is no longer just a health problem. Africa is losing its urban elite workforce, its doctors, mechanics, its hope for the future, and quite possibly ours. It sounds hopeless, and it may still sound removed from your life. That's what one group of Rotarians in a small, well-to-do California town once thought. People like Walter Singer. They called him Mr. Los Altos. His friend and fellow Rotarian, Mary Prochnow. And Dude Angius, the president of the Rotary Club of Los Altos. If you'd told these Rotarians that within a year they'd know 3 people with AIDS, they'd say you were crazy. Well, they'd be wrong.
I think it was probably a year ago Christmas that the story begins. That's when my son Steve came home from New York for the holidays. I think it was my daughter Tony who first noticed that he just wasn't quite right. So on Christmas morning, I asked him about it.
I said, are you feeling okay? He said, no, I'm not really feeling that good at all. I got a virus, and some time ago. And so that's all he needed to say. We knew he had AIDS. As a family, we just felt we had to do something because there's no way that we could see Steve dying of this disease and just that's the end of it. There had to be something better than that, and this coincided with the beginning of my Rotary year. And I shared with the club, I don't know what we want to do, but we have to do something. And then we just started meeting as a task force, and then we came up with this particular idea of educating every Rotarian in the world with regard to the epidemic that is AIDS and what we as Rotarians internationally could do and should do.
And the incoming president of Palo Alto Bayshore Club said yes, he would like to attend a meeting. And this was Greg Betts. And someone within the club asked Greg why particularly he was interested in the project. And he said, because I have AIDS. And everyone was stunned.
I've been proud to be successful in work, my achievements in college, and I'm embarrassed. I look at Dude and think of my own dad and think how it will feel to whether my dad will be as understanding as Dude and as loving towards his son seeing a dude's love of his son Steve and means a lot.
By the fall, the task force was really going great, but Steve was not doing well. Most of the other kids and their spouse had come home, and our attention was focused 24 hours a day on that corner bedroom of his.
I think one thing Barbara and Tony and I did in the beginning was we did, as most do, I guess, enrolled in an AIDS support group. And I think Tony lasted a second meeting, and I think when you left, you made a pretty good statement. Do you recall when you were describing that, sort of what Bob just said, you people really don't understand?
Everybody there was saying, playing it down that, yeah, when I was speaking about my brother, Steve, who is the focal point of our family. Sorry.
The statement she gave, though, was you don't understand. No one else is like my brother.
It's perhaps ironic that Steve would die the same day that we began filming.
It felt as if we were involved with something very important, that Steve's death was somehow going to help people understand the depths of the problem.
I met one of the Rotarians on Monday on some business, and he says, "Hey, Walter, do you know what's going to happen Thursday?" And I said, "No, what?" And he says, "I understand we have a member in the club who has AIDS." I said, "Impossible."
I'd like to introduce Walter Singer. Walter just did not fit the stereotype. People just didn't get it. Then he started to speak.
I'm going to talk to you about a matter of life and death. And I'm going to talk to you about my life. As you might remember, back in January of '84, I suffered a heart attack. I went to the hospital.
Well, he talked for several minutes about the heart attack, then the heart bypass, and the blood transfusions he needed, and how everything seemed to be fine until last spring when he got a letter from the hospital.
But they thought, with the AIDS epidemic, that I should come back to El Camino and take a blood test. And I read the letter and I threw it on my desk and I didn't think anything about it. And then Maria.
But he finally took not one but several tests. And then one day his doctor called him in.
And he says, "You're one of 4 patients who's a positive carrier of HIV." And so I thought I'd like to share that with you and let you know that I've been walking around with this. I've been asked to join support groups, which we haven't done, because they're mostly young people. I don't know what my outlook is. And the thing I like to ask my fellow Rotarians here, maybe you like to be my support group. Thank you.
Well, it has been an incredible year here in Los Altos. I know that you're probably saying that this could never happen to me. That's exactly what we said a year ago. Our club feels very strongly that something has to be done. Will you help us?
Ladies and gentlemen, Dushan Angius, former president of the Rotary Club of Los Altos.
Good morning. President Raja, on behalf of the Rotary Club of Los Altos, I would like to express our appreciation to you for your invitation to address this session. We are indeed honored by your interest and grateful for the opportunity to present a report on the status of our Rotary AIDS Project. Our presentation today will project a frightening perspective of a worldwide health crisis of unparalleled proportions. We will also present a scenario where in the world of Rotary, we can make a difference. At the outset, I must admit to a dichotomy of emotions. I'm extremely grateful to be able to address you this morning, something I never dreamed would be possible. But I also feel remorse, embarrassment, and guilt that it took the tragic loss of my son to finally get involved. Because I had not been personally affected, I ignored the mounting statistics and terrifying projections of this worldwide health crisis. I implore you to listen carefully this morning, to look beyond yourself, to decide to become part of the solution to this problem without having to suffer through the tragic experience of losing a loved one to AIDS. A Stanford University professor claims to have scientifically proven that when 5% of the people accept an idea, it is embedded. When 20% of the people accept it, it's unstoppable. The world of Rotary can make that difference. At its inception, the Rotary Club of Los Altos attempted to develop a project where others could personally identify with the lives of 3 fellow Rotarians. In our videotape, The Los Altos Story, we do not lecture, we do not preach, nor moralize. We simply personalize the account of each of these Rotarians and their families suffering the impact of an insidious and fatal disease. The theme is simple. Regardless of the source of infection, human beings are dying. There is no vaccine, there is no cure for AIDS. And although AIDS is 100% fatal, it is 100% preventable. This, then, was to become the project mission, prevention through education. Specific project goals are to change attitudes and behavior concerning this disease, support those afflicted, and to encourage scientific research to find a cure. Our goal is to have every single Rotarian in the world see this entire 30-minute film, 7 minutes of which you have just viewed, because we know from our experience that the film captures the viewer's attention, educates the viewer, and instills a sense of ownership of the problem. And we know, too, that once you understand this project, you will support it by developing in your own communities educational programs designed to prevent infection. As of this moment, hundreds of Rotary clubs have started AIDS projects of their own. Countless numbers of school districts, hospitals, corporations, civic and church groups are using the videotape to initiate or to enrich their own educational programs. The Los Altos Story has been distributed to every Rotary club in the United States and Canada. And at this convention, it is our goal to complete distribution to most of the other 16,000 Rotary clubs. To this end, the materials have been translated into French, German, Italian, Japanese, Portuguese, and Spanish. The response so far has been amazing, much beyond our wildest hopes and dreams. We have received over 2,000 letters and telephone calls, all compassionate and supportive. Many asking, what can I do to help? Others complimenting Rotary for taking the leadership to get involved in this controversial problem. And still others from families grateful to us for opening up an opportunity to talk about a disease that comes with such a terrible stigma attached to it. In his article in the Stanford Business School magazine, Los Altos Rotarian Dick Fouquet observes that the letters tell us of extremes of despair and hope, of the devastating fear of rejection and the blessing of compassion, of love implacably withheld and of love unconditionally extended. The letters tell us that the video's message has been received as one of hope and inspiration in the face of so much pain and fear. Because of the film, thousands of families personally afflicted by the disease feel less alone. To many of those stricken, the world of Rotary is making the difference. Allow me to take a moment to share with you a few examples of just how you are making a difference.
An article in the March issue of the Rotarian describes how the Rotary Club of Dundee, South Africa used the Los Altos story to initiate the very first AIDS awareness workshop for miners. Because of their efforts, 772 mine workers in northern South Africa are now learning of the dangers of AIDS and how to prevent infection. The Rotary Club of Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin used the Los Altos story to begin a comprehensive assault on the AIDS epidemic. Like so many clubs, its efforts began with the formation of its own Rotary AIDS Project, the objectives of which include increasing public awareness by showing the Los Altos story on its community access television station, promoting AIDS education in local schools and AIDS awareness in the workplace, providing support for those afflicted and helping to destigmatize the disease and to raise funds for AIDS research. The Los Altos story served as the impetus for District 5190 to launch a July 1st campaign to raise $750,000. Funds will be donated to the Center for AIDS Research at the University of California, Davis, to assist the center in its work to find a vaccine and cure for this dreaded disease. And in Australia, as an outgrowth of a recent multi-district seminar in Sydney, the Los Altos story provided the spark for next year's project in District 9680, Aid for AIDS, and was the catalyst for Rotary's current plans in Australia to bring the message to the nation through a coast-to-coast telecast of the Los Altos story. These examples merely scratch the surface of what is happening with literally hundreds of Rotary clubs since we first told the Los Altos story. To all of these clubs, I congratulate you and bring you thanks from Los Altos. You have looked beyond yourself. You are making a difference. At this point, I would once again like to thank President Raja for his support and that of past President Paulo, General Secretary Spencer Robinson, and so many key and caring people at Rotary International Headquarters. The interest and support expressed by President-elect Cliff is very much appreciated by our club, as is the ongoing support of past directors Mike Katsouris and Rick King. And to the Rotary Club of Orange County East do we extend our appreciation for its role in assisting our club in preparing for this convention. I thank the Rotary Club of Los Altos for so many things, for your commitment to this project, and for the compassion and support that you provided those of us devastated by this disease. And especially to those very special Rotarians who serve on our club's task force, for your depth of dedication and your extraordinary efforts. You have elevated the Rotary International motto, service above self, to the very highest level. We recognized early on that this project became a true labor of love for all of us, and we have often remarked that it just seemed to have wings of its own. The real wind beneath its wings was the writer and director of the film, Miss Robin Young, whose sensitivity and professional brilliance turned tragedy into powerful and compassionate message. Above all else, I wish to thank my family, and especially my wonderful wife, Barbara, for their love, courage, and support during some very difficult times during the past 3 years. But most of all, the program this morning is dedicated to 3 courageous people. Greg Betts, a good friend and an integral member of our task force, who is here with us today. Walter Singer, a revered community leader whose courage contributed so significantly to our project, who passed away in February. And to our son, Steve, whose beautiful life and untimely death inspired this project so that others just might be able to be saved from this devastating disease. Words will never be able to express adequately the loss we feel. However, with the growing impact of the Rotary AIDS Project, Steve's presence in our family has never been stronger. As you listen to today's featured speaker, please be thinking of how you can become involved. The film clip you viewed a few moments ago concluded with my stating that our club feels that something must be done. Will you help us? Einstein once said, if 2% of the people in the world all pulled in the same direction, we could change the consciousness of the world. With your compassion, your understanding, your support, you and the world of Rotary can make the difference. Will you look beyond yourself? Will you help us? Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you so very much. It is now my pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker. He has just flown in from Amsterdam, where he will chair the 8th Annual International Conference on AIDS in July. He received his BA from Harvard College, his MD from Washington University in St. Louis, and his MBH from the Harvard School of Public Health. He is professor of epidemiology and international health at the Harvard School of Public Health and director of International AIDS Center of the Harvard AIDS Institute. Prior to this position, he was director of the World Health Organization's Global Program on AIDS, based in Geneva, Switzerland. It is with great pleasure that I present to you, and would you please welcome the distinguished Dr. Jonathan Mann.
President Raja, Rotarians, and guests. I'm pleased and honored to be with you today, and I'm doubly honored to have finally met Dude Angius. As I flew down to Orlando yesterday, a bright, sunny 32,000 feet over the Carolinas, I kept wishing that I could bring you good news. I wished I could tell you that a cure for AIDS had been found, or that a vaccine was just around the corner. But I cannot. And the message I need to bring you is grim. But I believe that we will gain nothing from denial, and that complacency is a danger to us all. And taking directly to heart what the Los Altos story has to tell each of us, I come to you determined to tell it like it is, precisely so that we can best determine what must next be done. Today, over 10 years after AIDS was first discovered, a sober and realistic analysis of the pandemic leads to the conclusion that the global AIDS epidemic is threatening to run out of control. The world's vulnerability to the further spread of HIV, the virus which causes AIDS, is increasing, not decreasing. As the worldwide epidemic intensifies and accelerates, the national and international response is failing to keep up. And thus the gap between the pace of the pandemic and the pace of the response is now widening rapidly and dangerously, creating a global health emergency and calling urgently for global leadership and a new global approach to the problem. This is a dramatic situation. Let us consider its basic elements: the current status of the worldwide epidemic, predictions for the 1990s, and the status of the response to AIDS in the communities around the world and at the national and international level. And then, based on a clear view of the pandemic and the lessons we have learned from the last decade, let us consider what must now be done. What then is the status of the global epidemic? In 1980, an estimated 100,000 people worldwide were HIV infected. During the 1980s, that number increased more than 100-fold. Today, at least 13 million people, including 12 million adults and 1 million children, have been HIV infected. Of the 12 million HIV-infected adults in the world, nearly 8 million are in Africa, over 1 million each in North America and in Latin America, and over 1 million in Asia, and over 500,000 in Europe. Of the HIV-infected adults, about 85% have been infected through sexual spread, with a heterosexual to homosexual ratio of about 5-to-1. This means that the vast majority of the world's AIDS infections have been spread through heterosexual contact, man to woman, woman to man. Of the world's HIV-infected adults, about 7 million are men, and nearly 5 million are women, and the ratio of women to men in this epidemic has been steadily rising year by year. To understand AIDS, it is essential to recognize that it is a relatively new phenomenon. The virus may be old, but its international spread is recent. This newness of the epidemic has two important consequences. First, the epidemic, like all new phenomena, is still dynamic, volatile, and unstable. And second, the major impact of this epidemic is yet to come. It is vital to understand the dynamic quality of this epidemic. First, HIV is continuing to spread in every community and country which has thus far been affected. For example, in the United States, in the next 3 years, it is expected that between 120,000 and 240,000 people will become infected with HIV. In Europe, in 1991, last year, an estimated 75,000 people became newly infected with the virus. The basic point here is that there is no community, there is no country already affected by the epidemic in which HIV spread has stopped. The epidemic has not peaked in any country. Second, HIV is spreading, and sometimes quite rapidly, to communities and countries which have thus far been spared. For example, in Africa 5 years ago, HIV seemed to involve principally Eastern, Central, and parts of Southern Africa. Today, both West Africa and all of Southern Africa are heavily affected. Just to take one example, the level of HIV infection in the general adult population in the West African city of Abidjan, the capital of Côte d'Ivoire, increased from less than 1% of the population infected in 1987 to over 7% today. HIV is also spreading into the rural parts of Africa, which is where most of the people live. The net effect of all this is that the number of HIV-infected Africans has tripled in just 5 years. Reports from countries as distant as Paraguay, Greenland, and the various Pacific Island nations all illustrate the broad geographical range of this epidemic. But it is in Southeast Asia, in India, in Burma, and in Thailand that the volatile and explosive potential of this epidemic is now most dramatically seen. Within just a few years, the Thai epidemic, now involving at least 400,000 people, has become 10 times larger than the AIDS epidemic in the United Kingdom. A large heterosexual AIDS epidemic is now underway in India, with at least 1 million Indians HIV infected. By the mid to late 1990s, India will become the country with the largest number of HIV-infected people in the world. Indonesia and the Philippines may well be next. And by 1995, the number of HIV-infected people in Asia will exceed the number of HIV-infected people in all of the industrialized countries. It is clear that HIV will reach most, if not all, human communities. Geography may delay exposure to the epidemic, but it will not ultimately protect any community. It is no longer a question of if HIV will come, but only a question of when HIV will come. The third element of the pandemic's dynamic quality, is its increasing complexity as the epidemic matures. The epidemic globally is composed of thousands of smaller epidemics, and within each community, regardless of which persons, with whatever behaviors are first affected, HIV will spread through all available routes, and the epidemic will continue to evolve. For example, in the Caribbean, the majority of AIDS cases in the early 1980s involved homosexual men, while today, heterosexual transmission has become the major route of spread. The second major consequence that I mentioned about the newness of the pandemic is that its major impact is yet to come. The best estimate is that over 2 million adults and over 600,000 children worldwide have thus far developed AIDS during the pandemic. Yet, in the next 3 years, from this year to 1995, nearly 4 million people will develop AIDS. More people will develop AIDS in the next 3 years, that is the disease AIDS, than have developed AIDS during the entire history of the pandemic until now. In addition to a rapidly rising number of people with AIDS, the number of children orphaned by AIDS will more than double in the next 3 years, from approximately 1.8 million AIDS orphans today to 3.7 million AIDS orphans by 1995. A Harvard-based group, the Global AIDS Policy Coalition, has just completed a comprehensive analysis of the epidemic and the response. And we project that by 1995, the number of HIV-infected people will rise from 13 million to 20 million. And by the year 2000, between 38 and 110 million adults will become HIV infected. According to this scenario, up to 24 million adults and millions of children will develop the disease AIDS between now and the year 2000. It's clear that whether we consider the number of infected people, the number of orphans, the number of people with AIDS, or the impact this has on families and communities around the world, the decade to come is going to be very difficult. To illustrate with just a single example, the number of people who developed AIDS in Thailand in the last 5 years was about 150. In the next 5 years, 80,000 cases of AIDS are projected in that country. And yet, to understand this problem of AIDS, we have to go beyond the virus to human behavior, because human behavior, individual and collective, is the determining factor in this global epidemic. Let us turn then to the global response to AIDS. By the mid-1970s, AIDS, the virus of AIDS, was spreading worldwide, but we didn't even know it existed. This first early silent phase of the epidemic carries a great global lesson, which is that our modern world is vulnerable to the spread around the world of infectious agents. The lesson from AIDS in the first period of AIDS is that the world needs a global early warning system to identify future epidemics, future threats to health. The second period in the history of our confrontation with AIDS, a period of discovery and initial response, lasted from 1981 to about 1985. During this time, the scientific progress was very rapid. And then, following the first International AIDS Conference in 1985, the World Health Organization identified AIDS as a global epidemic and organized a program to mobilize resources against it. From 1986 to 1989, the World Health Organization developed a global AIDS strategy and mobilized an unprecedented level of activity. Most important during this period of mobilization was the fact that community and non-governmental organizations became active and numerous in the fight against AIDS. Community organizations were the pioneers, often launching innovative and creative programs like the Los Altos story, even before governments were ready to respond. At the community level, we have seen major successes in the fight against AIDS. From our analysis of programs around the world, we have identified 3 basic elements which must be present if a prevention program is to succeed. The first element is information and education. Most important in developing this information and education is the need to involve the people you are going to reach in the design of the education itself. The second important ingredient for successful prevention are health and social services linked to the prevention message. If the message, for example, is to stop using drugs, then drug treatment and related services must be available in that community. The third ingredient, more complex but just as important as the other two, is a supportive social environment. This means that people are supported and that active steps are taken to prevent discrimination and to promote people's human rights and people's dignity. This is not a luxury. This has been found to be an absolute necessity for a successful prevention program. And when these 3 are combined, as they have been in creative and innovative and courageous ways by community organizations around the world, then HIV transmission, the spread of the virus, has been markedly slowed. If any of those 3 elements, in contrast, is missing, then there we must state unequivocally that in that place, prevention is not being given a fair chance. But today, despite the fine work being done in many communities, the world has entered a new phase in its confrontation with AIDS, a period in which national and global response is failing to keep pace and therefore falling dangerously behind the pace of the global epidemic. The current global approach to AIDS seriously underestimates both the extent of the problem of AIDS and what must be done to deal with AIDS. What is wrong here? Why has the world failed to apply widely and well what we already know how to do? Why, despite the courage and commitment of many individuals and communities like those in Los Altos, why is the societal response faltering? How can we explain the paradox of plateauing resources and commitment at a time when the global epidemic is expanding and intensifying? To answer these questions requires that we consider the problem of AIDS from a societal rather than only from a biomedical perspective. The efforts thus far in prevention and care have been necessary and excellent, but they are not sufficient. There is not a single expert on AIDS in the world today who will tell you or who believes that a global effort based exclusively on doing what we have been doing so far by itself will succeed in stemming this global epidemic. To bring the epidemic under control, we have to go deeper. We have to confront the key underlying issues deeply embedded in our societies around the world, which actually fuel the spread of the virus. The AIDS pandemic is exploiting societal weaknesses. The central societal problem, which is responsible for ill health worldwide, is discrimination. To control AIDS, we must confront those particular forms of inequity and injustice, unfairness, discrimination, not in the abstract, but in the specific and concrete manifestations, because this fuels the spread of AIDS. If we examine the linkage between AIDS and human rights, we discover very quickly that people are not equal in their ability to protect themselves and others from HIV infection. The ability to control personal behavior is strongly influenced by societal circumstances. For example, the role and status of women worldwide is fundamental to HIV prevention. Yet women cannot say no to unwanted or unprotected sexual intercourse unless they also have the economic and social power to mean no. In several studies in Africa, women monogamously married to a man who has multiple sexual partners are becoming infected themselves with HIV, and they have no risk factor except their powerlessness to influence their husband's behavior. And therefore, reform of laws in that place, which govern property distribution after divorce, may be a much more important factor in helping to prevent the future spread of AIDS than increasing the distribution of brochures or condoms. Belonging to any marginalized or stigmatized social group creates an increased risk of becoming infected with HIV. And this is not for abstract or confusing reasons. It's very practical. It's because fewer resources, less information, and less social support translate into greater risks of exposure to HIV and to a decreased ability to put into practice the messages of prevention. In sum, helping people best equips them to contribute to HIV prevention. What then is to be done? A new global strategy is needed to do three things. First, to ensure that what we know already works is applied worldwide. Prevention and care strategies which have proven their effectiveness must be adapted and applied in communities around the world. There is no excuse for relearning the basic lessons of AIDS prevention. Second, we must improve and strengthen our existing efforts. We also need the moral leadership to develop a global ethic of caring, to remove the burden of discrimination from people with HIV infection, from people with AIDS, and from people with risk behaviors, because this discrimination is wrong, this discrimination is harmful, and this discrimination is costly. Third, we must launch a forthright assault on the basic problems, the underlying social conditions which create our vulnerability to AIDS, as well as our vulnerability to future epidemics. It is time for us to confront the many forms of discrimination based on gender, race, religion, national origin, sexual preference, or social class. These forms of discrimination in our societies, which make our societies vulnerable to the further spread of the epidemic. In short, this is a prescription for health, community, national, and global. Here we confront a fundamental paradox in the modern world. People in all countries are deeply concerned about their health, the health of their families and their children. This is obvious and it is universal. And yet, if health is really a central concern of all people, why is it that health has not become a central defining principle of local, national, and global purpose? Why do governments tremble, literally tremble, when the inflation rate rises or the price of gasoline rises, yet no governments fall over the infant mortality rate, low immunization levels, or violent deaths among adolescents? Why does national shame over homelessness or deaths from tobacco not cause governments to fall? Increasingly, worldwide, a claim is being heard that health is a human right, not a privilege. A bold vision is being proclaimed that health, in its full modern definition, take its rightful place as a universal aspiration, a common good of all peoples. In this sense, AIDS carries two messages for the future of health: the message of human rights and the message of global interdependence. Global interdependence is fundamental for an understanding of AIDS because it is the dominant reality of our time. Global interdependence is the direct result of the movement, extraordinary movements of people, goods, and ideas around the world accelerating in the last 25 years. While we in health have been slower than business or communications to grasp this reality and explore its implications, AIDS demonstrates clearly how a seemingly obscure health event elsewhere can become a health crisis here at home. As a result, a global perspective is emerging in health as it is emerging in the environment. AIDS is the first global health crisis, or more properly, the first health crisis seen and understood for the first time, felt to be global. Our global AIDS strategy, therefore, must be more than about AIDS. It is really about whether health, a central concern of all peoples, will or will not become in the future a central defining principle guiding national and global purpose. How much will this strategy cost? Our answer is first that leadership in health and leadership in society is precious, irreplaceable, but not necessarily expensive. Exactly 500 years ago, Columbus joined the two hemispheres, opening the global era of world history. Today, we are also discovering a new world. But to us, geography holds few mysteries. The great new world which lies before us is human, and our exploration is for new ways of connecting individuals, communities, and the world community for the benefit of all. We have now the opportunity to show we have learned lessons from the past 500 years. In Chinese, the word crisis is composed of two distinct words: the word for danger and the word for opportunity. The danger before us is clear. Let us seize the opportunity, because our challenge is to create, out of our knowledge of a global epidemic now spinning out of control, for us to create a new global vision of health, a vision of peace, a vision of solidarity, a vision of health, a vision strong enough, a vision wise enough, and a vision humane enough to protect and to ensure our global future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, both gentlemen, for this excellent presentation. First to Dr. Jonathan Mann, in appreciation for your appearance here today and with the greatest respect for your dedication to science and public health, please accept this commemorative book, Images of Rotary, and this crystal from Rotary International. And to you, Dude, fellow Rotarian, you have the admiration of all of the Rotary for your efforts in educating so many about this dreaded disease. please accept the images of Rotary and this crystal with our gratitude and thank you for sharing your story.